Okay, welcome everybody to Bridging the Carbon Gap, advancing from GHG accounting to impact reduction. I'm Ethan Soloviev. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at HowGood, and I am excited to be presenting this webinar today along with Nina De Palma, our Head of Product. Thanks for all of you who are making the time to join us. If you want to connect with our team at all while you're here, just head on over to howgood.com. There'll certainly be a point a little later in the webinar where we'll open it up for questions. Those will go in the chat and our team will take them. Thank you for being here today. Let's go forward and start with a bit of global context. I'm going to tell a bit of the story from our experience at COP28 in Dubai and set the larger context for carbon accounting in the world. This is a critical time in the history of our species on the planet. And finally, the world has woken up to the importance of food and agriculture in combating climate change. COP28 was really a huge moment of getting together over 200 countries all over the world, people coming together to work on climate and how we're going to move things as a planet. We have this great quote from the Minister of Climate Change and the Environment, who said there's no path to achieving the goals of the climate agreement and keeping within 1.5 that does not interact with food systems, agriculture, and climate. They have to go together. At COP28 in Dubai, our CEO was there. I was there for the entire length of it. There were people from indigenous communities, from NGOs, from corporations, all getting together to work on this. And despite what you maybe heard on the news, the tone was not oil heavy. It wasn't, bad because it was in an oil nation. 2/3 of every COP that has ever happened have actually taken place in oil producing nations. People were there together to make change and to see if we can agree as a world, everybody together, on what's going to happen. And we did. We made it to a historic agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. Even more important from our perspective was that there was this announcement, this declaration, the Emirates Declaration came out the first day. 130 countries signed up right away on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action. Now it's up to 160 countries have signed on to this, including the United States. There's huge progress because of the work that was done at Glasgow, at COP, at Egypt the year before. There's this momentum building around food because food and ag can be part of the solution. Yes, it's a huge part of the problem. 30 to 40% of greenhouse gas impact comes from food and ag, 70% of global freshwater use, and food and agriculture are the primary driver. Some say up to 90% of land use change and biodiversity loss. And food demand is predicted to grow by 50% by 2050. So it is a major impact, but it's also food and ag are the only industry that can be a solution. Any other industry, transport, energy, manufacturing, you can reduce your impact there. You can sort of get towards a 0 point, but food and agriculture is the only place that can actually capture carbon. You can suck it into the soil, we can put it into living biomass, we can enhance biodiversity. This is the key that food and agriculture can be a nature-based solution, and maybe the biggest one, an important one, because it has so many other benefits. This is what we focused on in our events that we hosted at COP28 and continue to at other events around the world. We have to be looking at regenerative agriculture. And beyond that, it's not just the farming. We can't put it all on the farmers. It's regenerative food systems as a whole that we need to be pushing forward. Just because we had that momentum at COP didn't mean it was taken for granted. There was a moment about halfway through the last week where a draft of the global stocktake came out, the main sort of document at COP, and food wasn't mentioned in it. It was like it was stripped out, it was gone, it wasn't even there. And so I was sitting with a colleague from Unilever and formerly Danone and EIT Food, and we said, we need to do something about this. We got on a little WhatsApp group. There's a WhatsApp group with 750 plus food systems people who are at COP, of the 100,000 people that were there. And very quickly, it wasn't just us, but there was this motion amongst that group to push on the negotiators, to push on the ministers to include food in the global stocktake. The minister of Rwanda called out in a big plenary session. And then it just took a couple days, and the next draft, food was explicitly in the text for mitigation, for adaptation, which is a really important step forward. Now there's a clear mandate. There's a strong global consensus on the potential of food and ag. This was echoed in Davos last month. And we're already planning about how to push this forward at the major global events, at the Biodiversity COP in Colombia, at COP29 in Azerbaijan. If you or your teams will be there and want to collaborate, just let us know. We'd love to dig in with you. So we also know that there was sort of a push that was happening because of this global mandate and agreement. This kind of puts the pressure on to food companies even further. We're going to transition away from fossil fuels, but we need some pressure in order to do that. So on top of this agreement, there's also regulatory pressures coming in. We have, from the upcoming SEC rule, the existing requirements from the European CSRD, the California climate law, plus voluntary systems like Science-Based Targets Initiative, CDP, and others. And there's pressure from investors who are increasingly demanding progress and changing the cost of capital for companies that are either moving further ahead in their climate ambitions or slowing down. So all of this is good progress. Commitments are growing. There's 4,521 companies that have set science-based targets. And this is excellent. This is like really good progress. Over 1,000 have set net zero targets, including 64 food companies have set net zero targets. It's a good step. We expect this number to continue increasing. However, and as this sort of poignant cover from The Economist said, as we were heading into COP, we've made some progress. We'll get a B+ on making commitments, but we must try harder, keeping to the commitments, financing the commitments, actually moving things forward, investing in them. And you may be experiencing this yourselves and your companies. It's a lot harder to finance and actually push things forward than it is to make the commitment. Now, to set the target, you had to start measuring, you had to start reporting emissions. This accounting is a big step, but we're seeing real challenges when it comes to working on reduction and making strides to meet those targets. Reduction's not happening nearly as fast or as quickly as we need it to. Many are saying there's not even a chance to hit 1.5 degrees anymore, and the consequences are looking more and more dire from the science. So why is this the case? Why is this happening? A recent survey from SBTI said that 85% of companies believe that getting primary data is a barrier to even setting their targets. And we see a larger group, 80% are also saying that scope 3, that's sort of harder. Scope 1 and 2, pretty straightforward. We've got our arms around it. But for scope 3, especially categories 1 and 11, are the hardest to get data on and are the hardest to decarbonize. Scope 11 is that use of sold products. Scope 1 is that category 1 is that purchased goods and services. As a result of the challenge, 2/3 of companies have low confidence in their ability to deliver on the targets that they've set. This really means that only about 30% of us are feeling like we have a clear path. 50% of companies are reporting they're already off track to meet their targets. So what we're hearing from the industry is that with reporting as complex as it is, there's not enough time to work on the reduction. And we're still having reporting happening primarily at that corporate level from that scope 1 and 2 top down. For food and agriculture companies, where scope 3 is 90% in many cases, for retailers it's 90% of the overall emissions, this doesn't give the level of detail that we need. If you're just working on scope 1 and 2, you're coming top down. You can't just use CDP reports to choose between material suppliers or to renovate or innovate your formulas. You need more detailed and granular data. And the reduction that we need is really got to be in the supply system on the ingredient level at the agricultural level. We are seeing some progress, and there are some shining examples to point out, fortunately, despite the challenge. One example is from IKEA. I heard about this in person at Davos from Jesper Brodin, the CEO of IKEA, some data from their climate report in their baseline year 2016. They had 31 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents emitted. And by 8 years later, by F22, they had gone down to 27 million tons, 12% reduction over that time period. That's great. That's really exciting. And then last year, this is from the F23 report that just came out, they were down 10% more. So they went to minus 22%, only 24 million tons CO2 equivalents emitted, absolute across the entire business. Now, they did at the same time that they were growing their business and growing sales. In 2016, net revenues were 35 billion euros. In 2023, it's 47 billion euros. So 35% revenue growth over that time that they reduced absolute emissions by 22%. So it is possible to make reductions and move things forward. Another great example comes from Danone, HowGood's partner. Danone is doing incredible work in this realm. This is a diagram directly from their recently published report, their climate transition plan. I highly recommend you go and check out this plan. It shows their path to achieving their science-based target, their 2030 goal. You see that they're showing their business as usual. You can see how in their waterfall diagram, how are they going to move towards their target? They're going to work on milk. Of course, that's a major ingredient for Danone and their other ingredients. They're going to work on pack and logistics and comment, but also low carbon by design, working at the individual formulation level to decarbonize. Each of these things, each of these arenas has its own write-up in the plan that says specifically and exactly what they're going to do to be moving towards these targets. This is great. Their transparency is making the whole industry smarter and better equipped. And they need to go to that ingredient and product focused innovation to pull this off. Going back to the overall context of carbon accounting, it's important to do accounting. It's important to measure and account for all the impacts. You're starting to learn to do that well already, but ultimately we can't just do the accounting. As my colleague Caitlin Liebert, VP of Sustainability over at Whole Foods, says, you can't just spreadsheet your way out of the climate crisis. We need to collaborate. We need to work together. We need tools. We need systems so that you can make the progress. Like at COP, when we collaborated to push things forward on a bigger scale and get food into the agreement, we need to work holistically on the whole system in order to achieve our goals. So I think what I'm going to pass it over in a moment to my colleague Nina is to talk about how we bridge that gap between just the accounting and the reporting and actual reduction. We have to go from knowing the numbers and knowing what the baseline is to figuring out how we step down this waterfall and hit our target. So I'm going to pass it over to Nina. She'll talk through how HowGood is helping our partners go from just carbon reporting into clear action on carbon reduction. Nina, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ethan. And before I move forward, I just want to mention that as people have questions now or later on, feel free to drop them in the chat. Our team will be reviewing, and then we'll be responding and doing a little QA session at the end. So to get started, I actually want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we've been referring to as the carbon gap. So at HowGood, we've been lucky to spend the past 17 years working with the leading food and bev companies really across the world to ultimately help them reduce the impact of their products. And the companies we've been partnering with really have been at the forefront of the industry with sustainability at their core. And as regulations have gained momentum over the past year, as Ethan mentioned, we've started to hear two common challenges. Now, the first is this increasing tension between carbon accounting and carbon reduction. Now, given limited resources and the expectations to disclose, sustainability teams like yours are having to prioritize carbon accounting over carbon reduction. And of course, we all know that these shouldn't really be competing priorities. Carbon accounting should ideally be in the service of carbon reduction. The second challenge we've seen is really how data siloing can impede progress. Now, I'm sure we all know what this looks and feels like. Each team is really on their own to come up with the data they need to accurately measure their footprint, let alone model meaningful changes or engage with their supply chain on progress and projects. Budgets are limited, and ownership over the data only extends to the specific use for that individual or department, which means that even in the most advanced organizations, there are often multiple ways their impact is being measured. Now, everyone is doing their best with the resources that they have available. Ultimately, though, this lands us in a spot where the data is siloed, and ultimately it's not able to be operationalized. Now, the one thing we do know is that reduction is a team sport. So the more alignment you can find within your organization, the more likely you are to succeed. And we're seeing that with so many of our partners and the other players that Ethan mentioned earlier. When you marry up the ongoing efforts across your R&D teams, your sourcing teams, your procurement teams, alongside your sales and marketing teams, the momentum really builds. And that's really the reason why we built Lattice. It's a tool built specifically for food companies, food and beverage companies, to better manage their sustainability efforts and make smarter data-driven decisions. And in hearing the specific challenges, listening to customers over the past few months, we saw an opportunity to help bridge that gap between corporate carbon accounting and carbon reduction so that teams can manage their carbon accounting alongside their reduction efforts, and companies no longer have to choose between corporate accounting and more granular product carbon footprinting. By eliminating those data silos and unifying the data powering sustainability strategy, Lattice allows you to hit the accelerate button on the road to your climate goals. So let's jump in to our carbon accounting solution. What you see on the screen here is your starting point. Now, knowing that the end goal is to drive reduction, where do we start? Well, the first step is to measure your company's total emissions as accurately and as easily as possible. And of course, always in compliance with the GHG protocol standard. Here, you can see a comprehensive view of all of your emissions in one place. Now, for most companies, this is probably where you've made the most headway. Let's start diving into scopes 1 and 2, the emissions that you're probably most familiar with. I can click into any category and see the activity data that's used to calculate the total emissions. Once the data is populated, emissions are automatically calculated and updated dynamically as I make changes. Scope 1 and 2 emissions related to your own operations are likely where you've spent the most time to date. And while the accounting here is relatively straightforward, we know that often a lot of the time is spent just trying to wrangle the data from all over your ecosystem. So with Lattice, we give you an automated, easy to read view of your emissions across all 3 scopes. Whether you're managing exclusively in spreadsheets, knitting together data sources from across your organization, or working with established data aggregators. We know that while it might not make up a significant portion of your total emissions, this is usually where you have the most control. And so we want to make it really easy to identify where the hotspots are coming from and target reduction efforts right away. Now, let's look at scope 3. Scope 3, at first glance, is a little overwhelming, especially relative to scopes 1 and 2. There are 15 categories that capture indirect emissions across a wide range of activities, from the crops that you source, the finished goods you purchase, to corporate business travel or waste generated in your facilities. Now, that said, you're likely not reporting on all categories from the get-go, and that's fine. Lattice is designed to support you along your journey as you start measuring and accounting for more and more of your indirect emissions. We also have an extensive partnership ecosystem to support with that data aggregation and remove some of the traditional barriers to reporting. The data is already out there, believe it or not. It's just a matter of putting it all together into a single solution. We've built a set of features here to make tracking progress easy and flexible. So you can mark the categories that are not relevant to your business. You can drop in notes to track data sources or other specific nuances. You can easily identify gaps where you may still need to find data. And you can mark categories as complete to save your progress incrementally over time. All right, let's jump into scope 3, category 1, purchase goods and services. Scope 3, category 1, makes up the large majority of a food company's total emissions, upwards of 75%. And it is also the most challenging when it comes to measuring and reducing. Now, before we talk about how we calculate emissions for scope 3.1, I actually want to take a minute to talk about why this piece of the puzzle is so complex. Scope 3 emissions for food companies ultimately relies on agricultural emissions data. And frankly, agriculture is quite complex. I think that complexity is actually part of why so many of us are drawn to it. I know it's true for me. But it means that the emissions associated with an ingredient can differ wildly based on where it's grown, how it's processed, and the list goes on. But because our platform Lattice is powered by HowGood's agricultural emissions database, we've already done all the hard work for you to measure your scope 3 emissions for food products. Okay, so let's talk about what this means. How does Lattice help to significantly simplify this process? First, you'll see you can calculate emissions for your purchased goods and services, both food and non-food. Now, looking specifically at how Lattice automatically measures emissions for your purchased food materials within 3.1. What we're looking at here is actually really unique to Lattice. Lattice is the only tool that can automatically measure scope 3 emissions for all of your purchased food materials with this level of specificity based on just the name of the material and how much you're purchasing. So all you need is very basic procurement data, a list of materials that you purchase along with the purchasing volume. Once that's loaded in, you have access to our dashboards built specifically to manage 3.1. Which also includes a breakout for flag emissions. We'll take a look at that in a second. So why is this significant? Well, as Ethan mentioned, and as you probably know, most companies, 85% of companies, say that access to primary supplier data is the reason they're not able to measure and reduce their scope 3 emissions. But because HowGood has the world's largest database of crop and even ingredient-specific emissions factors, we can calculate emissions across your procurement portfolio without any primary data. Now, we think this is a really critical unlock for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it removes the dependency on that primary data collection. Most suppliers don't have the primary data you'd be looking for. And honestly, we can't expect them to. The level of supplier maturity required to provide emissions data for each material is significant. And even if they had it for one ingredient, they likely will not have it for all their ingredients. Ultimately, we can't wait for the primary data to be collected in order to start reducing. We really need to start now. So what Lattice does is it fills the gaps and levels the playing field so you can get started. Now, the second unlock here is that it really allows you to take back control over your scope 3 emissions. It's easy to focus on scope 1 and 2 as it's directly within your control, and you should continue to do that. It's very important. But food companies can, in fact, have control over their scope 3 emissions. The decisions you make can significantly influence the impact you have when it comes to scope 3. The difference is that these decisions are not about your operations and how you fuel your facilities. It's about how you make your products, the products you decide to make, how you make them, the ingredients you choose to put in them, and the vendors you choose to work with. Those are your scope 3 drivers. And Lattice is the platform that gives you the insight into the impact of each of those choices. So once you've uploaded all of your data, we can zoom back out and see how each scope and category contributes to your total footprint. And as we suspected, scope 3 contributes to nearly 90% of my total emissions here. Of course, I will have reduction initiatives running across all 3 scopes, but to really make a significant dent in my total corporate carbon footprint, I'm going to have to work on reducing scope 3 emissions. So let's see what that looks like. First, looking at 3.1, I can easily see a breakdown of my top contributing materials and vendors. This makes it easy to identify carbon-intensive materials at a glance. And then you can zoom into those materials and vendors that have the greatest potential to move the needle. This is enabling our partners to be much more strategic in how they prioritize and invest in reduction efforts. And I have a few recent examples to share with you that really illuminate how these insights can inform your carbon reduction strategy. So we have one partner that was looking for data to support which categories they need to identify as strategic priorities for the organization. In seeing that their top 4 materials contributing to scope 3 emissions were all coming from the flavors category, they were very easily able to take that data back to the cross-functional team working on that strategy. We have another partner who found that of over 100 suppliers, only 10 of them made up 55% of their total scope 3 category 1 emissions. And so they've been able to use that to inform and prioritize their supplier engagement and design tailored pathways to drive radical reduction. Now, we see our customers using this to power their sourcing strategies, decide which suppliers to engage, and to vet or test assumptions that they may have internally. So the goal is that once you've measured and had a chance to dig in to some of these insights that can help to inform your reduction strategy, you're going to want to set reduction targets and start modeling scenarios to achieve them. Now, what we think is really important here is keeping up with updates in the regulatory landscape. So as we discussed earlier, there have been a lot of new developments in the space over the last year, and we can only expect that more directives and guidance will be emerging in the coming months. Luckily, the way that Lattice is designed means it's ready to respond to those updates as they come in. And as you can see here, we have an integrated flag dashboard that makes it easy to track, manage, and most importantly, reduce your flag emissions. You can also create specific initiatives to your business and set goals to make sure that you're translating those initiatives into action. Okay, so you've measured your baseline, you have your targets. How do you actually start reducing? Well, reduction on scope 3 really requires that you look at your sourcing, but also to assess your portfolio of products in order to identify reduction opportunities and work towards a more sustainable portfolio. So when we dive in at the ingredient or material level, we can explore the carbon reduction potential. We can identify hotspots and consider other possible abatement tactics. You can model the impact of changes to ingredients and sourcing. Now, we know that when it comes to reduction opportunities, what's feasible for one company may not be for another. It's true. And what is viable for you will differ based on how far along you are on your reduction journey, which is why Lattice equips users with insights across various reduction levers and offers the tools to play around with whichever levers are interesting and most relevant to your business. So speaking of levers, I actually want to walk us through what some of those levers are before we move into Q&A. As we've mentioned, decarbonization really is a team sport. And among our partners, the teams that are making the most progress are actually using the insights to involve other teams and drive that cross-functional action across multiple departments, including procurement, R&D, marketing, and of course, sustainability. So the first lever here is designing towards decarbonization. And this is really about building sustainability into the way you build products, but also into how you communicate, how you sell and promote your products. By developing or reformulating with sustainability in mind, we have a huge potential to decarbonize right there. But as food companies, we also play a very important role in influencing and guiding customers towards more sustainable choices. So the second lever is to refine your procurement strategy. And really, this is the heart of the matter when it comes to scope 3. This is where the ability simply to quantify goes a long way. And we know that many companies have implemented, invested in responsible sourcing initiatives, as an example. And Lattice is the platform that puts the data behind those decisions. By powering the ability to assess impact at various levels of your business, from brand to product, material to vendor, Lattice also ensures you're aware of all of the various implications of sourcing decisions. so that you can coordinate across teams and find the most viable path and procurement scenarios. And lastly, we have a third lever, which is engaging your suppliers on abatements. This is really about the collaboration we need to see happening that's already happening across the industry and across the supply chain. We need to all be working together and partnering together to implement abatement tactics. Lattice starts by making it super easy to engage your suppliers and to collect and integrate primary data, requesting only the necessary information and in a standardized format. Then you can identify abatement opportunities and take the insights from Lattice to talk with your suppliers and come up with a joint action plan. You can track those initiatives in Lattice and move towards progress. Before I hand it back over to Ethan, I just want to say we are so excited to be part of this journey with you. We have always been dedicated to helping accelerate progress towards impact reduction here at HowGood, and we've been developing our platform to do just that. We've seen tremendous excitement among our customer base and the partners who are already utilizing the platform, and we hope that bringing carbon accounting and reduction into a single cross-functional platform is really just the beginning. Ethan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Nina, for walking us through the platform. We've got some great questions coming in. Please add your questions, ask more questions, thumb up other people's questions. I'm going to pick up, there was one in there that's got a couple thumbs that says, what methodology is used to calculate the land use change emissions? So we're going to touch on that in just a moment. And to answer questions, I will be answering some questions. Nina De Palma, head of product, and also Liz Aspley, our data scientist who has worked a lot on land use change, will be picking up and answering questions. So Liz, I'm going to pass this first one, what methodology is used to calculate land use change emissions, over to you.
Thanks. We do a statistical land use change calculation. We're following the draft land sector removals guidance for this and closely monitoring the release of the final guidance. For statistical land use change, for those who really like the technical nitty-gritties, we are using a time discounting factor of a linear discounting factor, and our product allocation factor is the shared responsibility method.
And what about direct land use change? And will we ever, what are your thoughts, Liz, on direct land use change and what we would need to include direct land use change alongside our statistical land use change? Yeah, just love to hear your thoughts on that. I have a hunch people.
To include direct land use change with statistical land use change, we would need supplier data on the yield, what they're growing, any previous land types for where that is growing and what's growing there now.
Excellent, thank you. And we're one of the first companies that put land use change into our platform across all ingredients, materials, and locations, even though land sector removals guidance from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has not been finalized. We've been in close touch with them as they're building it out and have a pretty good sense of what the final will be. So figured we might as well get it out there, have people start using it now, and then of course we'll update it when it becomes finalized. I'm going to pick up a question a little from before. It says, I'm very interested to know how this platform captures primary data from supply chain upstream suppliers and raw material suppliers. So there's a number of routes to that. Nina mentioned the ingredient supplier portal, which is a one-stop shop for suppliers to come in and get access to different ways they can provide data. What we find is that some of the platforms out there are just too onerous, require too much of suppliers. They'll send a 70-page detailed LCA questionnaire that would take a PhD LCA person 100 hours to fill out, and then complain about not getting enough responses back. We find that we need to engage softer and easier to start, asking some of the key questions to get some basic responses, basic information. We can do a lot of modeling based on that. And then through building relationships with suppliers, we can get more and more information. Once we've built trust with your company and the suppliers, we find that a lot more data comes through, especially once they learn that they can get a lot of value out of our platform as well. We have some major ingredient suppliers who are actively using the platform, proactively providing supplier-specific data. so that many more food manufacturing companies and retailers can get access to it. This is our impact data network that any customer immediately becomes part of, which is heading towards following the WBCSD PACT standards for sharing of carbon data, so that there can be a unified, interoperable way to pass product carbon footprints back and forth. I would also say that for modeling of on-the-ground, detailed agricultural practices, we have a partnership with Cool Farm Alliance and can use Cool Farm assays and the modeling that comes out of that to input into the system. We also have a partner, Regrow Ag, who does more detailed MRV and on-the-ground modeling and checking of data. So there's a number of different on-ramps that suppliers can get data into the platform. Okay, there's another question that says, is there a feature of collecting data internally within an organization? And Nina, I'm going to pass that over to you.
Yeah, great question. So we actually work with companies kind of across the spectrum when it comes to how established the sustainability programs are, but also how established the data collection and management is in this regard. We sort of take the approach of meeting you wherever you're at on that journey. So within the platform, we have a number of different features that are oriented around that, but also it's where our customer support teams and our professional services can come into play as well. So each of our partners gets onboarded with a sort of data mapping and assessment exercise that helps us to get a sense of where you're at, and make a plan together on what the sort of next steps are in regards to data collection just from within your organization.
Thank you. There's another question here that I am going to pass over to Liz, which is curious to hear more about how the product carbon footprint is generated at that level of detail with product name and amount, especially since you mentioned the emissions can vary so widely by location. Liz, I'll pass it to you to start, and then I can also pick up a bit.
Yeah, so as Nina mentioned earlier, customers really vary on where they are in this journey. And so our platform is able to make really good assumptions based on our years of experience in this arena. And then as you have more data, as you get better levels of granularity, we can update those impacts and show you the differences.
Yeah, and I can also say that there is a step-by-step algorithm that we've vetted because of working with retailers for so many years. We have over 2 million products in the database. And so when we see a product name and an ingredient list, we know we can figure out the category. Our AI engine figures out the percent inclusion of ingredients. We map that to the most likely heuristic locations of the supply of those ingredients based on country of manufacturing, and produce a heuristic response that is very, very accurate. We've tested it. And then you can always go in and add more detail as your supply system becomes more clear. And I think I'm going to take that to a point that's coming in from Desmond. Decarbonizing the platform is using data from online or certified databases. There's a significant factor of error for many reasons, especially with some of the databases that are out there, especially when they're using global averages. We would totally agree with that. And so it's important to be heading towards primary and granular data. Absolutely, we're 100% on board with that. That's why there's such a focus now in our impact data network of gathering more primary and granular data. The reality faced by most food companies is that getting that level of granularity across the thousands of products, tens of thousands of ingredients, hundreds of suppliers, or thousands of suppliers is quite onerous. And you can't take, in this rapid changing environment where we need to make progress really quickly, you can't take 6 months to figure out exactly where everything was from and exactly what the practices were on the ground. So we have built a hybrid system that uses the broader secondary databases with a really great degree of granularity. So as an example, the World Food Lifecycle Assessment Database, which is a great database, which is out there from Qantas, they have about 3,000 crop location combinations available in their system, at least according to their website. HowGood's database out of the gate has 90,000 of that same number of ingredients and locations. So it's already 30x another leading database on the market. So we very quickly go from that broad global average into the granular, and then you can figure out who are your most important suppliers and go engage with them to get towards that primary granular data. We all need that. We all need to help each other do it. So I would basically just agree with this point and say one last thought, which is that I think it will be most useful if, rather than going one-to-one and a single company trying to get information out of a single supplier or single farm, if we could change it so that it's many-to-many, so that if we could coordinate requests and responses from many food companies who want granular data and send that back upstream through the tiers of the supply system to suppliers, that should increase the response rate. And if you have an interoperable platform that can pass it all through with the same methodology, everybody should save time and money. So again, that's the impact data network that we are building out. Okay, I'm going to pass it to some other folks here. Let's see. Is your tool more useful for companies just starting to define their baseline, or how would it work for a company that's already set their baseline? Nina, can I pass that one to you for an initial response?
Sure. I might not give you a straight answer because the answer is kind of both. We understand that actually, like a couple of us have said, there's a ton of variety in terms of where people are landing on this spectrum. We work with companies that on both sides. If you've already established your baseline and are looking to reset your baseline, or to move straight into action, we can help to support you with that. That's work we're very familiar with at the enterprise level. But if you're just getting started, Lattice is also a perfect tool. It's very easy to get up and running, and so can help you to establish that baseline very quickly.
Great. Thank you, Nina. There's a question here that says, which Nina also may be to you. It says, we typically sell our products into larger companies like Danone, but our carbon accounting has been calculated through a different company. Can we be integrated into a larger company's HowGood's platform for Scope 3 emissions? I don't know, I kind of butchered the question, but I think you get the point. Nina, your response here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And you actually started to speak to this a little bit when you were mentioning that network. The answer is yes. And the even more exciting answer is that we're already seeing this happen across the industry. So by linking up companies that sell into other organizations, not only can we help to operationalize and make more efficient the sort of underlying data transfers, but we've also seen it can be tremendously useful to just foster those relationships by being able to sell in additional SKUs or sort of better represent the ongoing efforts that you've already put into your products as you move into those B2B conversations. So it's very cool to see it happening across multiple players we're working with right now. Ethan, I'll hand it back to you, I think maybe to wrap up before we hit time.
Sounds great. I'm going to just hit that last question from Laura about emerging technologies for food ingredients. Yes, we are actively looking at a number of them in the cultured meat and the plant-based space. And I would say emerging technologies, one of the most exciting ones is around artificial intelligence and AI being used at multiple stages of the life cycle of product design and sales. We're doing a session on that at Natural Products Expo West coming up if you're going to be there in March, and in general focusing a lot on the continued development of artificial intelligence in food and in decarbonization coming up. So I'll just point out before we wrap up that we have another webinar. It's called Beyond the Baseline. This is with Christina Lampert, our Director of Growth and Innovation, really focused on how you unlock quantifiable carbon reduction strategies, mapping out for your company exactly what you can do. That's coming up soon, so we hope to see you all there. Thank you for coming and for all of your questions and engagement today. See you soon.
Bye, guys. Thank you so much.